Good afternoon. My name is Asher Kaufman, and I'm the director of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. It's really exciting to see so many unruly people. I guess it fits your reputation and the reason for which you are all here. So I'm very pleased that we are hosting this conference. It's clearly a very important conference for us. It squarely fits within our mission as a peace institute. As we all know, wars have been a central field of inquiry since the dawn of history. Anti-war action has also been studied extensively, but rarely has there been enough attention to anti-war activism within militaries enduring wartime. And clearly, for many of you, this is not only a scholarly engagement, but a personal journey, personal experience. And I could sense the excitement as I was walking in, trying to make my way through to get to here. So this conference does exactly that. It brings these two fields together, the study of war and the study of anti-war activity during wartime, which is really worthy. I'm extremely thankful for David Kortweit for his leadership here at Kroc and for his hard work to make this important conference happen. And I'm also thankful for Kroc's staff who have assisted David in the organization and execution of this conference. Just to mention a few names, Lisa, Laurel, Ellie, and Grace have all been very helpful in making it all happen. Rumors go that David has also recruited his own family. So I see Karen here and your son is here, so thankfully all this makes it all a family enterprise, which is add to the level of excitement and the intimacy. So we have three distinguished speakers here in this panel, titled Historical Perspectives on the Vietnam Anti-War Movement. I will present all three of them together, and so that we save time in between speakers. Starting with Christian Appy, who is a professor of history at the University of Massachusetts. His research specialties include modern United States history and the Vietnam War. He is the author of American Reckoning, the Vietnam War and Our National Identity from 2015, Patriots, the Vietnam War Remembered from All Sides from 2003, and Working Class War, American Combat Soldiers and Vietnam from 1993. Madame Ninh is the president of the Ho Chi Minh City Peace and Development Foundation. She is the former vice chair of Vietnam's National Assembly of the Foreign Affairs Committee. She is actively engaged in raising public awareness on sustainable development, gender advancement, and youth empowerment, as well as rapprochement with the Vietnamese diaspora and the impact of war legacies such as Agent Orange dioxin in Vietnam. And last but not least, Michael Kazin, who is a professor of history at Georgetown University, who specializes in US politics and social movements of the 19th and 20th century. He is the editor of Dissent, a leading magazine of the American left since 1954. His books include War Against War, The American Fight for Peace 1914 to 1918, just published last year, and The American Dreamers, How the Left Changed a Nation from 2011. Each speaker has 20 minutes to speak, and I will bring some order to this order, and be very strict in stopping them from making sure that they keep up their 20 minutes so that we have ample time for questions and answers. So the floor is yours, Christian, please. Thanks.
Thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you to everyone at the Kroc Institute for including me. Quite honestly, this is one of the great honors of my life to join you. I saw something extraordinary out in the gallery in the hallway that I thought I would share with you. It's a quotation from Dr. Howard Levy, who, as many in the room know, was an Army doctor who in the mid-60s refused to train Green Beret medics to go to Vietnam, for which, not surprisingly, he was court-martialed and convicted and jailed. He apparently said at one point, and I'm quoting, "Future historians choosing to ignore the GI movement will find their reputation in tatters." I like that, but maybe 50 years is too soon to judge. But quite honestly, I don't know a single historian whose reputation has been hurt by not knowing about the GI movement. So sorry to begin on that negative note, but it makes me think that the feeling I have most, above all, being here, is the wish that my students could be here to talk with you and to listen about all the ideas and experiences and history that are so alive and palpable in this room. So I fervently hope not only will historians be defamed for not knowing about all of you, that it will inspire all of us to do a better job at communicating to all generations across all boundaries about the power and potential of peacemaking. I especially wish my students were here because it seems to me that for 4 decades since the end of the Vietnam War, most of them actually have heard very positive stories, very few positive stories about any anti-war activist, civilian or military. I think in recent years, I do feel more and more students have the basis for some kind of critique of the war. They've seen horrible pictures for it. They may even have heard the term American imperialism. But what they do clearly lack is an understanding that the basis for a critical analysis of that war or any war, or never mind all the other problems we're suffering, emerges from social movements and anti-war movements. Those are the groups that provide the education and the information as well as the confrontation to raise those issues. So they haven't learned to acknowledge or affirm the importance of social movements. Indeed, in the decades since Vietnam, the most vibrant and diverse anti-war movement in our history has either disappeared from common public memory, or it has been lampooned, falsely stereotyped, and even demonized. Think only of the movie Forrest Gump. Now, that's an old movie now, 1990 or whatever it was, but actually most students that I've asked have seen it. The one thing that you may remember about it is that it has a scene in which Forrest Gump comes back wearing the highest medal conferred, Medal of Honor, and he's surrounded in an anti-war demonstration by sort of 5 Abby Hoffman lookalikes. And when Forrest Gump is introduced to sort of the heavy, the anti-war heavy guy, the activist, he takes one look at Forrest Gump and he says, "Who's this baby killer?" So that, in a nutshell, shows the reinforcements of the kind of the stereotypes that David alluded to at the very beginning of today, and that Jerry Lemke has written about, and David Parsons, and half the people in this audience. So as a result of that, we have, I think, too much broadly in our land, and not just young people, but 40-somethings I know very well, who sort of see the generation of the 60s divided into 2 camps. There are the anti-war civilians, and the anti-war movement is almost entirely thought of as civilians with no relationship to the military, as hopelessly self-righteous, self-absorbed, and mean and nasty, jerks, people who like nothing better than to spit upon, or at least in some way or another express disdain for returning veterans. And then on the other side, this image of veterans as kind of patriotic hero victims. They're not unequivocal heroes, but they have a kind of victim status. The classic example of that, of course, is Rambo. I mean, Rambo just so totally fits that sort of image of the hero victim. To follow this just a step further, I've had many students over the years who honestly believe that the most shameful thing about the Vietnam War is the treatment accorded to returning American veterans. Not the 3 million Vietnamese who were killed in the war and the million plus that were killed in Laos and Cambodia. Not the 8 million tons of bombs that were dropped on Southeast Asia. Not the indiscriminate use of napalm and Agent Orange and the thousands of villages that were destroyed and the millions of people that were forcibly relocated from their ancestral homelands. Not even, it may seem minor, in contrast to those graphic absences of knowledge, but there's a scant knowledge that the United States, from the very outset of our intervention going back to the 1940s, have subverted the possible democratic outcomes that would have made a war unnecessary, both in the immediate aftermath of World War II and at the Geneva Accords, which called for a nationwide election under a single government. So we always have to ask, what is the purpose of myths? And the myth of the veteran as patriot, the anti-war protester as disloyal, what function does it serve? What political use does it have? And it serves many uses, but the most obvious is it serves to undergird and support American imperialism. And beyond that, to bolster a faith that was shredded by the Vietnam War, the faith in American exceptionalism. The whole point of my most recent book, American Reckoning, is to try to suggest that the Vietnam War, more than any other event in our history, undermined that broad faith that the United States is everywhere and always a force for good in the world, always the good guys in world history, always on the side of democracy and freedom and human rights. By 1969 and 1970, that was in tatters. I mean, even pro-war supporters, when confronted with the evidence of My Lai, the best response they could come up with was, well, this happens in all wars. Every country commits war crimes. Well, once you concede that, you've pretty much thrown American exceptionalism out the window, haven't you? I mean, if everybody does it, aren't we supposed to put a higher price on life than other countries? That was sort of a bedrock idea in American exceptionalism. Of course, the problem with this myth is it also, of course, makes us forget the fact that many soldiers themselves were involved in anti-war activism. And it as well makes us fail to see that there were many sincere and actually successful efforts of collaboration between the civilian anti-war movement and active duty military personnel. If you hoped that the Ken Burns, Lynn Novick documentary would right that ship and correct it, I'm afraid not. It did indeed sort of reinforce our distorted view of vets as noble victims, and the anti-war movement was hardly represented at all. Indeed, there are only actually two people in that film, by my count, who represented the anti-war movement who lacked any affiliation to the military through a family relationship or were actually in the service themselves. And both of them, at least on camera, who knows what was cut, but at least on camera, Zimmerman and Nancy Bieberman, they are allowed, what they say is mostly critical of the anti-war movement and sort of reinforces this idea that they were sort of self-serving and mean to veterans. On the other hand, to its credit, one thing that is laudable to a degree about the Burns-Novick documentary is it does have veterans American Vietnam veterans on camera talking about their coming to anti-war position on the war and even joining in the anti-war movement. There are quite a few, and that's valuable. My problem with the way that's handled, however, is that these veterans speak inside a bubble. Quite literally, the way they're framed, with these very close headshots. And so they are abstracted from their own history. They are looking back on their history and telling their story, but there's no sense of engagement with either the past or the present. The bubble is the present as well. They're not engaging with the current wars. I mean, I kept thinking, why don't they show these veterans walking through Vietnamese villages or interacting with a group of other veterans, sharing their experiences? Or even better yet, why aren't they shown talking to veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars and sharing experiences across time? If I may have missed something, but correct me if I'm wrong, was the word Afghanistan or Iraq even uttered once in that 18 hours of that documentary? I don't think so.
No, you didn't miss anything, bro.
Okay, thank you. So our job is obvious, and a number of people have already mentioned that, and that is to really try to recover and communicate this extraordinarily rich and varied history of anti-war dissent and to try to connect it to the present. Very briefly, I want to suggest to you that this is an effort in the creation of a long history of the peace movement and a long history of GI and veteran dissent. I'm borrowing that phrase from Jacqueline Dowd Hall, a historian who about 12 years ago wrote a pretty famous article in a historical journal saying that the civil rights movement should be studied as a long history, that the conventional chronology really just focuses on a few years in the 60s, but that's a movement that has very deep roots. And so too, I think, with the study of peace. And that's all I'm going to say, because I suspect that Michael will have some things to say about that longer history of anti-war activists. So let me just make my own little effort to try to bring us back to the GI anti-war movement of the 60s and 70s by telling a short story that's probably familiar to a number of you about two very young African-American Marines, George Daniels and William Harvey, who in the summer of 1967 were at Pendleton, Camp Pendleton. How much? Okay. And they conducted a sort of rap session after lunchtime chow with about 15 other African-American soldiers. And they raised a very important question. Is this our war? To which George Daniels says, no, this is not our war. This is a white man's war. And our war is here at home. And indeed, it's raging right now in the streets of Detroit, where we are now in the 5th day of the worst urban riot of the decade. 43 dead, 8,000 National Guard brought in to suppress disorder, almost 5,000 paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne. So he made this case that became very familiar in the 1960s, the racial one. And for that, he and Harvey were court-martialed and convicted of Daniels' 10 years of hard labor in the Portsmouth Naval Prison, sort of Alcatraz of New England. 6 years for Harvey. They appealed it. The appeal failed. They were convicted on the Smith Act, which is bizarre if you know anything about that, as well as the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The appeal failed. They did get the sentence dropped to, I think, 4 and 3 years, but still, it shows you so dramatically how hard the military can crack down on dissent and the obstacles to the creation of a GI movement, and particularly how hard the sentences are for service people of color. Not that white people were exempt, but the sentences were almost never as harsh. They were convicted simply of talking about the Vietnam War. There had been no mutiny, no disobedience whatsoever, simply for talking about the war. Now, the key point I want to make here is if you jump just 4 years ahead to 1971, while the military could still crack down hard, and there was still real brutality in the brigs, which were filling up to the max. I mean, there was torture in the Pemberton Brig in 1969. I've seen illustrations of the stress, the tying people up in the stress positions. So they could still be tough, but there's no way if they had to put everyone in the brig who was talking against the war, talking to hundreds of thousands of people. So by then we really had a mass movement led by working class soldiers, multiracial, not all together, not an integrated movement. That itself is an important subject to pursue. I mean, the key years of anti-war protest, as people have sort of suggested, coincided with the rise of black nationalism, the Black Panther movement, so it's really not a surprise that these movements, as David Courtwright and other people have written, ran in tandem or parallel rather than much interchange. And there are other reasons for that too. I mean, I think even one of the VVAW did a very creative thing in playing on patriotic iconography. They called their investigation the Winter Soldier after Tom Paine. They marched on Valley Forge. They did an occupation of the Statue of Liberty. They marched on Lexington Green. They went to, what's her name, Bessie Ross's house, to raise challenges to this, are we living up to our revolutionary tradition? But to a growing number of African Americans who believed that they lived, and all people of color lived in colonized neighborhoods and reservations, they would say, why are we even referring to the American Revolution? The revolution is yet to come. So anti-colonialism begins at home, begins here, and then we can make it globally. So there were these tensions that we still have to think about in trying to bring everyone into this struggle. There was, as the decade went on, every imaginable protest, though they began earlier than many people understand. I keep coming across examples of combat avoidance, not yet direct combat refusal, not mutiny, but as early as 66 and 67, you have units sandbagging operations, meaning they just go out to a safe place even though they've been ordered to go on a more dangerous ambush or operation. Even in the Marines, I recently met a guy who was there in 67, and he said even some lieutenants were participating. But the other, it involved everything from dress violations to petitions to, letters, hundreds of thousands of letters to Congress, underground newspapers, skyrocketing desertions, skyrocketing applications for CO status within the military, and outright mutiny. In 1975, even the military admitted that there were 35 instances of mutiny within the 1st Cavalry Division alone, and those were only the ones they counted. So by the end of the war, many studies have shown that nearly half of everyone in the military had committed some act of disobedience. So I wouldn't at all marginalize this as a minority movement. This was a mass movement. And indeed, if you look at that figure and ask how many people disobeyed on college campuses, I bet you it doesn't rise to that level. So that really was the center. And there should be this bumper sticker in the mid-60s. Suppose they gave a war and nobody came. And everyone rightly said, that's sort of hopelessly naive. I mean, isn't it? I mean, the military can get the people it needs. But by the end of the war, that bumper sticker was actually becoming close to a reality. Or to borrow a phrase from Richard Moser, I think is here in his book, he says a very significant minority of the American military had declared a ceasefire in this war. And so briefly, just to chalk up some of the achievements, I do agree with, not maybe everyone here, but a number of you, that it did, the GI movement didn't end the war soon enough, but it did, I think, end the war sooner than it might have been. And I think we'll learn more about that when Carolyn Eisenberg's book gets published. One final thing. It did also play a role in the end, I think, of the draft. And one sort of interesting thing that doesn't get noted is that they raised the standards of work. How many unions in the country have raised the pay of any worker from $126 a month in 1971 to $326 a month in '74? That was the GI movement that did that. So lots more to talk about. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Friends, I'd like to start by thanking David Courtwright and the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at Notre Dame University for affording me this opportunity to take part in what I consider the third in a series of events that deal with the anti-war movement in the US, particularly among the military. I was fortunate to attend the Vietnam Peace March commemoration in Washington, D.C. last October, where David was also attending, and also very happy to support the Waging Peace series of activities in Vietnam conducted by Ron Carver and Connie Field, whose beautiful, powerful documentary you will be able to see. It was premiered in Vietnam, which was very meaningful, the year of the 50th year of the My Lai massacre. And this exercise that we are involved in takes place against the backdrop of the Burns and Novick documentary on the Vietnam War. Seems to me, from what I have heard through these three events, that some of the motivation for our exercise is precisely as a, how should I say, well, as a contribution to the conversation, not to leave it only to Ken Burns and Lynn Novick, which is in danger of mainstreaming, rewriting, and reinterpretation of the war. I'm speaking to you as a Vietnamese born and raised in southern Vietnam. And I traveled in my youth years with a Republic of Vietnam passport. But I opposed the war while I was studying in Paris, and I took part in anti-war demonstrations in Paris. And I never identified with the government of the Republic of Vietnam, because to me, the Republic of Vietnam was just an artificial creation of the major powers, and more particularly of the US, at the Geneva Accords. My allegiance is to the country of Vietnam, which has been one for several thousand years. So today I will not make a presentation. I'd like in the 20 minutes I'm imparted, just bring to you a testimony from a Vietnamese and an analysis of how I understand your contribution to your own history and how it has affected also we, the Vietnamese. So the first point I'd like to make is that we are engaged in a crucial exercise. In French, they have a perfect word for it, which is used particularly for the Jewish diaspora, when they try to make sure that future generations do not forget the Holocaust. So in French they call travail de mémoire. In English, I will try and say that it's a work of owning the past, your past and your country's past. So to own the past, you need to know, but also to understand, and only then can you own it. Of course, you need to understand it in a certain way, in a way that is closer to truth, as close to truth as possible. And you have to learn, and learn from both what one did right and one did wrong. I will not speak about the US, I will speak about Vietnam. For example, we Vietnamese, we have done a lot of things right, but we did a number of things wrong. All of you, especially, researchers, scholars of history, you have heard about the land reform, which was really a serious mistake of our party. That we have to look in the face and to understand what went wrong. The original idea of distributing land to landless farmers in itself is not a crime, is not an error, but it's how it was done, how it was not controlled, and the excesses that it led to. So in other words, you can have good intentions, but if you don't prepare properly with a proper strategy and policy and monitoring, it can lead to excesses. So we have to, looking back, we have to learn the lessons from that land reform. Following the end of the war, one major error or mistake in policy that we did was the re-education camps. Now, here I have to pause and explain. My own brother was a captain in the RVN army. And mind you, for those of you who have studied and who have visited, who know Vietnam, in that war, tell me which family doesn't have members on either side. You would have, a colonel down south, a general up north. Frankly, I know several cases like that. That's part of life, You are separated, and on each side you live and you rise and you do things. And so within the same family, you had people on, in both apparatus of power. And at the end of the war, which ended abruptly, you remember, very abruptly, my own brother, who was in a re-education camp for 5 years, when he came back, he told me, you know what, as an army man, I understand why we had to be put in re-education camps. It was a security measure. The fear was that there would be a kind of guerrilla by elements of the Saigon army trying to keep the fight and not accepting the end of the war. So keeping us confined for some time so we could not regroup. He found that as a military man, he understood the logic of it. And he told me, if we had been, most of us, except for those whom this side considered as having been guilty of heavy crimes, then he said we would have supported the new regime. So when I hear that, I really, really feel sad that we let it go on and on for several years. I think, and I've spoken publicly here and there about this. Now, perhaps people in government are not yet ready, but I think the time will come when we look back at post-75 policies. This is one of the policies that we did wrong. we could have, liberated most of them, of the inmates, much, much earlier. So we did ourselves wrong. The third thing I think we should learn from our past mistakes is Cambodia. Those of you who are students of international relations, you remember the Cambodia issue. I support our moving our troops into Cambodia, because for those of you who followed closely, you remember that the Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge, were killing our civilians along the, southwestern border. I mean, doing atrocities, And at first, our government tried to speak sense, to negotiate with the Khmer Rouge, but those were crazy people, and they hated us to the point that they would not stop. And so in the end, there was no other way than sending our troops. So I'm not against our sending our troops. And actually, as we defended our own security and our citizens' lives, we did a service to the Cambodian people, because it stopped the genocide, the killing fields, for those of you who've seen the documentary, The Killing Fields. But the fact that we stayed on, we should have stayed only 1 or 2 years to help the new regime, take over and stabilize. But the fact that our troops stayed on too long, I think, was a mistake. So I'm mentioning to you these 3 issues to say that even also for Vietnam, it's not easy to draw lessons from past mistakes. Lessons from success, that's easy. Lessons from mistakes, that's difficult. It's difficult for us, but as I will say later, it's even more difficult for you. Why? Why it's even more difficult for America. So this exercise, travail de mémoire, owning the past, I think is crucial for the US, but it's important for us too, and we need to do our own travail de mémoire. Our young people, they don't know anything. They are too busy studying, starting startups, thinking technology, wanting to go and have a look at the US and Canada and UK and so on and so forth. So the war to them is very remote. It's not quite, something urgent. So I am now engaged in trying to help the young people pay the attention they need to pay to their country's past, because it is also their own history. Now, when we look at the past, about the good things, is I think about the missed opportunities between the US and Vietnam. I suppose that all of you have heard about the letters that President Ho Chi Minh sent to President Truman, seeking assistance from the US, because Ho Chi Minh had read American history and your liberation struggle against British colonial rule. So it sort of seemed logic, a flowing logic, that the US would be sort of prepared to lend a positive ear to the call for assistance from Vietnam against French colonial rule. That did not pass to happen, and so this is the tragic missed opportunity. We could have saved a war between our 2 countries. Anyhow, let me now make my second point, which is that this exercise, this work, requires a soul-searching revisiting of the notion of patriotism. I'm sure with this audience that you understand what I mean. To me, anyhow, patriotism is not allegiance to a transient government or to an undeserving government, as I considered the government of Saigon prior 75. To me, it was governing the southern part of Vietnam, but it was an undeserving government. I would not, give my allegiance to that government. My allegiance was to my people and to my country, the whole country of Vietnam, not just the South. I had relatives in the North. Second, it's allegiance to what is right and to one's conscience. And this is exactly what the conscientious objectors on your side, the deserters, for patriotic reasons did. This is also what, Hugh Thompson did in Malay. And then for us, when you start from that kind of perspective about understanding about patriotism, then for you, the enemy is not the country, not the people. The US have never been our eternal enemy. The US as a country, the American people as a people, never, but only the US government and war machine of that time. So, because of that, it was possible for us to connect and empathize with the people's groups, popular groups, women's groups, and also even veterans and GI, activist GI groups who were against the war. And because of that too, it explains why, war crimes were committed during the Vietnam War by American troops. It is because your troops, your soldiers, were put in harm's way. American troops to me, you will correct me if I'm wrong, but American troops during the Second World War, when the fight was clear, it was to defeat Nazism. It was a legitimate cause. And so when soldiers are sent to a legitimate war for a legitimate cause, they are much, much, much less likely to perpetrate war crimes. And so My Lai and other atrocities, they were possible partly because of that, because US soldiers were sent to the wrong war. And the same would apply to the Abu Ghraib incident. When Abu Ghraib happened in Iraq, an international journalist interviewed me, put a microphone in front of me and said, "What do you think about Abu Ghraib?" I didn't go into specifics or details. I just said one thing. This is what happens when you send your troops into a war. They don't know why they take part in it. So instead of bringing the best in them, it brings out the worst in them. And in all of us, there's the best and the worst. And if you put them in the wrong war, in the illegitimate war, the worst is bound to come out. On the contrary, some people have said, well, I even heard one academic more or less implying that Secretary General of the Communist Party, Leizwan, was a sort of a hawkish leader, and he forced his people to continue the war. I said, you got it quite wrong. He didn't have to force us. It's the US bombs, the constant bombing. You just have to be under the bombs, Nobody has to tell you to take up arms to bring that war to an end, that aggression to an end. So, well, my last point will be to say something, and I venture you have to correct me again. That's my purely subjective interpretation. The kind of challenges I've mentioned occur to any country, including mine. But you, the US, you have more specific challenges because, one, you are the top superpower. And especially after the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, you were the only remaining superpower. So, you know, it has increased the so-called hubris, you know, arrogance of the superpower. And so that's why superpowers cut my country in two. And we were too weak at Geneva to force our way to, you know, liberating the whole country. We had to accept a compromise. But this artificial partition that came from superpower hubris, I think. You know, and when I, as a diplomat at the United Nations, general debate, I heard the foreign secretary, state secretary, say that the US was the indispensable nation. You know, that was after the end of the Cold War. Or I think it was the US president who said, we will act multilaterally when we can and unilaterally if we must. So it's like the pleasure of the king, you know. I'm sorry, it's my diplomat background, you know, that's coming back. Well, anyhow, secondly, the US people has had no experience of war and destruction. You know, you haven't seen and felt directly war and destruction on your territory since Civil War. And that's how I interpret the utter shock of September 11. To you, you know, when you see what's happening in Syria and so on and so forth, what happened in Hanoi under the bombing, you know, it was nearly part of that life. It was never part of your life since the 19th century. Next point is, I agree with what Nathan Smith said. This sanitized war means that today it's even harder for the anti-war movement to question war and for the population, the broad population, to react to the victims of war, because you hardly see them. The victims of, you know, the soldiers that died during the Vietnam War, you saw it on TV. It was brought on TV screens at home. And finally, the real final, is just also the sheer size of the USA as a quasi-continent, which means, in a sense, that you are very insular. Well, at least the average youth in the US is very insular, not very open and aware of other cultures, other peoples, especially peoples of the developing world. So this is, in fact, a disadvantage that you have. You're highly educated, but culturally not so sensitive. I'm sorry to have to say that. I mean, thank you. Correct me if I said something that you don't agree with. Thank you.
It's a little overwhelming to speak after that wonderful talk. I spent about 10 years of my life in the anti-war movement, from 65 to 75. I did a few other things too, but that was always the most central thing that I was doing. And it really formed who I am today and got me to be a historian. It's continued. I continue to be an activist and a historian. In this crowd, I don't really feel I need to give a sort of activist talk. I'm going to give more of a historian's talk, though obviously the two are closely connected in many ways. I wrote this book called War Against War, which Asher mentioned, came out last year on the centennial of the U.S. declaration of war against Germany in 1917, and that got me thinking about anti-war movements in history. And so I wanted to say a few things about that too, but I also want to talk at first about some rather interesting, maybe even remarkable parallels between the two largest anti-war movements in American history. One during World War I, which was larger before the United States got into the war than it was once the United States got into the war, in large part because the Wilson administration and the Congress and the federal judges made sure that it was very difficult to protest World War I. As most of you know, the Espionage Act was passed during the war, the Sedition Act passed during the war, which essentially made protesting the war illegal. Everyone who protested the war, everyone who spoke against the war was not prosecuted for that. That would have been impossible, but many people were. And one of the things to think about in comparison between those two movements is that the opponents of each war were countering liberal presidents, idealistic presidents, who most of them had earlier supported, actually, what they were doing domestically. Woodrow Wilson, as most of you probably know, when he called on the United States to enter the war against Germany after the war in Europe and Middle East had been going on for almost 3 years, he said the United States is not going to war for conquest. The U.S. is going to war to create a world made safe for democracy. And earlier, he'd given a speech calling for a peace without victory. 50 years later, Lyndon Johnson, there with two of the leaders of the Republic of South Vietnam, who we all remember, Thieu and Key, gave a speech in Johns Hopkins University, sounded almost exactly like the speech Woodrow Wilson gave, parts of it at least, calling on the U.S. to enter the war. He called for a peace without conquest, in a world where every country can shape its own destiny. So the liberal idealism of the presidents that the anti-war movements 100 years ago and 50 years ago went up against had an important part, I think, in disillusioning people in those movements about that kind of liberal messianic internationalism. Because, of course, most men's messianic phrases came to seem both hollow and really obscene by most anti-war critics. Another interesting thing is that even some of the imagery of the anti-war movement during the Vietnam days used images from World War I. This, of course, is the famous James Montgomery flag, Uncle Sam Wants You poster, repurposed 52 years later to be an anti-Vietnam War poster. And also, both movements 100 years ago and 50 years ago flourished, I think, in part because they attracted experienced organizers from other movements. We often forget, when people study social movements, people involved in social movements, how much each social movement depends on the experiences of, the rhetoric of, and the individuals from other movements who enter that anti-war movement, usually after they've been involved in other movements first. Not always, but often the most experienced and most effective organizers are those who have experience in other movements. That was true, as we know, in the 1960s, where many of the most talented anti-war organizers came from other movements on the broad left against poverty, for civil liberties, for nuclear disarmament, and especially for black liberation. We had learned to define our politics as a deeply moral undertaking in those earlier movements, before we got in the anti-war movement. Muhammad Ali, famously, of course, applied for conscientious objection, saying, "I ain't got no quarrel with the Viet Cong. No Viet Cong ever called me N-word." And this helped to forge a very tight connection, I think, between people who've been in the Black Freedom Movement and in the anti-war movement. Earlier, we heard about Julian Bond, of course, leader of SNCC, who gets denied his seat in the Georgia state legislature because SNCC opposed the war in Vietnam. And so a passionate internationalism was taken for granted in the 1960s, as it was 100 years ago. 100 years ago, some of the leaders of that movement, very quickly, were prominent socialists. The American Socialist Party was one of the two major socialist parties in the world to oppose the entry of their nation to World War I. The other one was Italy. There are anarchists like Emma Goldman, feminists like Crystal Eastman and Jane Addams, and many progressive senators from both parties. Robert La Follette, probably the most important of them. So, as the great community organizer Saul Alinsky used to say, I'm paraphrasing here, if you want to organize something, first find people who have organized something else. Because we have this romantic sense sometimes that people just wake up one day and say, this is wrong, I'm going to do something about it. Well, people do that. That's true. But usually the people who help to convince them that something is wrong are people who already have been involved in social justice movements before. Now, this is a point that was touched on earlier, but I want to emphasize it. Why did the earlier movement against World War I fail, and the one that we were all involved in, well, not all of us, but most of us, 50 years ago, succeed? Interestingly, it's very likely that the U.S. intervention in World War I was actually less popular before the declaration of war in April 1917 than the U.S. intervention in Vietnam was until the Tet Offensive in this winter of 1968, by which time, of course, as you know, over 500,000 American troops were in Vietnam. So actually mobilization against World War I, the U.S. entry into World War I, had gone farther. Even before the U.S. actually did declare war, than was true in the Vietnam War movement, anti-Vietnam movement. The main reason I think why the anti-war movement 100 years ago did not succeed was that the war was so short and was victorious for the United States. More Americans died in combat in World War I than in Vietnam. But the majority of them died in one battle, the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne, which began in September 1918 and ended on the Armistice Day, November 1918. So the contrast to the Vietnam War, I think, is striking, because it took about 3 years after Johnson began escalating the war before a plurality of Americans turned against the war, according to public opinion polls. And even though all honor to people who were my heroes at the time and still my heroes, people who in the military and opposed the war, who knows what would have happened if the National Liberation Front had not mounted the Tet Offensive, which of course, as we know, was terribly destructive of the troops of the NLF. But nevertheless, as you know, the publicity for that war helped to turn, I think, a majority of Americans against the war, I believe, for the first time. So in the end, and this is a point that was made earlier, the anti-war movement succeeded because the Vietnamese kept fighting U.S. forces to a stalemate. I wish it hadn't taken so many deaths for American politicians finally to give up the effort, but sadly, it did. Now, a second theme I want to touch on is why, other people talked about this too, why so few Americans know about the movement against the war in Vietnam. In comparison to all the Americans who have learned one way or another about the Black Freedom Movement, about the feminist movement, even about the movement for gay and lesbian liberation. There were monuments for all those movements. Stonewall, Bar in Greenwich Village is a monument, in effect, to LGBT movement. And of course, there are civil rights museums around the country, some very wonderful ones, and the one in Memphis, for example. And of course, there was a monument on the Mall to one of the great leaders of the Black Freedom Movement, not the only one, Dr. King. But it's going to be a while before we have a monument to the anti-war movement. And this reflects, I'm afraid to say, perhaps I'm wrong, and there's a lot of people here who have written wonderful books about aspects of the anti-war movement in the Vietnam era, reflects what we talked about before here today, is the absence of recognition of how important that movement was in helping to end the war and in linking up with other social movements, which most Americans have learned to, at least if only grudgingly, think were good ideas, like the Black Freedom Movement and the women's movement. There's still only one survey of opposition to the war in Vietnam, right? Tom Wells's book, not a great book, but it's time for 2 or 3 other great surveys, I think. My book's the only book of synthesis of opposition to World War I, which was the other great anti-war movement. And I think it's that neglect by scholars, which has something to do with the terrible treatment of the anti-war movement in the Burns and Novick series that people have talked about. They could not have made a sort of both sides were, equally interesting and honorable about the Black Freedom Movement. Nobody was going to say, well, Bull Connor was doing his best. He was wrong, but we have to sympathize with him. Nobody would do that. I'm sorry. So how do we? But as an historian, have to try to explain why there's this relative neglect. I know it's relative neglect. People here have written wonderful books about this, but in general, anti-war movements in America are kind of the orphan of of scholarship of social movements. After all, the United States has been at war through most of its history, if you count the wars against Native Americans, which you have to count. And in fact, there's been opposition of one kind or another to most of those wars. So why, so little understanding and recognition of those movements? Some of it, I think, has to do with the reverence for the military, which has always run deep in U.S. history. I tell my students, I ask them how many American presidents became president because of their military service. And they don't know much history usually when they're first-year students. They say, oh, there was Eisenhower and I guess Grant. In fact, 10 American presidents, a quarter of those who were elected in their own right, won office largely or partially on the strength of their military exploits. Another reason, I think, is that the study of peace movements, the study of anti-war movements, sort of part of the history of diplomacy, the history of war, which has been dominated for most of its history by scholars who focus on powerful men in and out of uniform who made decisions to prepare for and fight and then negotiate an end to armed conflicts. Citizens who challenged their decisions seemed marginal to that larger history. And also something else which is uncomfortable for those who are opposed to war is that wars, in America at least, have often accelerated reforms that those who opposed the war supported. Women's suffrage, for example, triumphed in part as a result of the role women played in World War I. The Black Freedom Movement got a huge boost in numbers and influence as a result of World War II. So there's other examples I can give as well. So that has not happened with the Iraq War and the Afghan War, but it has happened with earlier ones. How much time? 5 minutes, okay. I thought I had 25 minutes. Got to stop ad-libbing here. I think the very nature of anti-war movements plays a part in this neglect as well. Anti-war movements are not like other movements, if you think about it. Other movements are long movements. There's a long women's movement, a long LGBT movement, a long environmental movement, a long civil rights movement. They can take a long time to grow. They can have setbacks. They can, different generations of people can sign on to them and leave them, and the movement keeps going forward and often keeps making gains. Anti-war movements aren't like that. Anti-war movements, at least massive ones that have much success, have to grow quickly. They have to stop a war that's already going on or to stop a war that's about to happen, as in World War I, as in the huge demonstrations right before the US invaded Iraq in 2003, I heard about before. So anti-war activists are always with us, and all of us are anti-war activists, or most of us at least, but most people don't know what we're doing unless there's a war that we're opposing, unless there's a war we're opposing and being at all successful in opposing. So that's, I think, a problem too. Finally, I want to say a few words about why no mass anti-war movement today. There's been some comments on that. There's many courageous soldiers who've tried to oppose those wars and have in many ways. We've heard from two of them this morning, of course, Nathan and Jonathan. I think one of the things that's interesting about the wars that are going on now is that Americans don't have stopped supporting them, according to public opinion polls, would like the United States to leave, but they're not all that, interested in doing anything about it. There have been anti-war demonstrations, of course. This is one of the largest ones in 2007, one of the last largest ones over a decade ago in Washington, D.C. But part of the problem, I think, is, again, to go back to the sense of morality, which drives people into social movements. When I and other people in this room were opposing the Vietnam War, we had a very clear sense that if we were successful and the United States withdrew, the Vietnamese people would control their own country. And we were all for that. Some of us chanted, Ho Ho Chi Minh, NLF is gonna win. And wore, NLF flags on our lapels, which might not have been the best idea to convince some Americans. But anyway, we did it and we felt proud about it. But today, I don't know of any Americans who oppose the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq who would say, yeah, sure, let ISIS win, let the Taliban win, no problem, So morally, it's a more complicated case. I'm not saying the United States should stay in those countries. That's a different argument. But to convince a lot of Americans that it's a mistake for us still to be there, you have to make a more complicated argument about innocent civilians dying from drone strikes that are launched by people sitting in an office in Northern Virginia, near where I live, and elsewhere, but it's not the same. So there's a lack of a moral internationalism, I think, among progressive people, like pretty much all of us in this room, I believe, which was there 50 years ago, which is not there today. Michael Walzer, a political theorist who used to co-edit Dissent with me, has written, "The default position of the left is the best foreign policy is a good domestic policy." I think that's true for many people, not just on the left, but on the right as well. In some ways, that's what Donald Trump was trying to get at when he said about America first and do things only for the United States. I want to end with one of my favorite, talk a little bit, one of my favorite anti-war documents of all time in America, which is The Moral Equivalent of War by great philosopher William James, written in 1910, before World War I. And one of the reasons it's a great document is because he hated war. He said war made history into a bath of blood. But he was very conscious of why it was so difficult to mount opposition to war. And he said in the first line of that essay, the war against war is going to be no holiday excursion or camping party. And he didn't know the half of it. But the point is that in order, I think, to build an anti-war movement today, an anti-militarist movement today, all the things we've been talking about and that we would dearly like to have, we have to take very seriously the reasons why those movements have had a hard time getting off their feet, and why there have been so few of those movements in American history. So, sorry to leave you with a sober message like that. The task is nevertheless, as vitally important as ever. But I think the only way it's going to happen is, again, if, and someone said this earlier, I think, if those of us who are trying to build an anti-war and anti-militarist movement do link up with other movements already there, because that's the only way it's ever happened in the past. Thank you.
I think we have some time for questions. Yes, go ahead.
You need a mic.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll take a few together. So, and then the one next to you. Yeah.
Hi, David Zeiger. Chris, I really appreciate your points about Forrest Gump and the whole kind of the onslaught in the 20 years, 30 years after the Vietnam War of from Hollywood. Forrest Gump was the tip of the iceberg. That really culminated in the massive spitting stories that came out in the context of the first invasion of Iraq. And just in terms of the connection between Vietnam and today and the war, there's general connections, but there's very specific ones. And I think the spitting stories are so central to that. Ken Burns, 6 months before that series was on TV, he was all over the news. He was doing interviews. He was time after time after time. He said, "My central goal with this series is to make sure that never again will American soldiers be denigrated by the American public." That was his goal. And every documentary film, just like every narrative film, you have kind of one central theme you're trying to get across. And if you look at all of the things that happened in that series, with how he depicted students, how he depicted veterans, everything, it was all with that one goal in mind. And it was not out of ignorance. Ken Burns is not dumb. He knew. He knew about the GI anti-war movement. He knew about the veterans movement. So it's a very conscious thing that went on. And how that relates to today, to me, was very much illustrated in that first the demonstration that Jonathan spoke of against the invasion of Iraq, largest demonstration in the history of the world, history of the U.S. before the invasion. I remember sitting in meetings planning those demonstrations, and people, including and unfortunately mainly people out of the 60s, saying, we've got to be very careful not to make the same mistake that we made in the 60s. We don't target the soldiers. This has become the dogma of what happened. And what killed the anti-war movement against Iraq was, in a nutshell, American soldiers were now in harm's way. And once that happened, this mythology that comes directly out of the Vietnam War took hold and had a massive chilling effect on opposition to that war, and I think that's gone on since. And I think that was, by the way, that banner was carried very proudly by Barack Obama. So this is huge.
Could I make a comment in response?
Sure.
Just since it's, I know you want to get a couple, but I agree with everything you said. I mean, the wisdom was simply to support the troops. When no one said in that documentary, or even in much public discourse, the obvious thing that you could sort of tick off in a couple of minutes. Obviously, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Vietnam are very different countries with different histories and cultures. However, in terms of American policy, once again, as in Vietnam, we were engaged in wars under false pretext. We're sending hundreds of thousands of troops to far distant lands where they're widely perceived as invaders or occupiers, where they're given the impossible task of propping up unpopular governments that don't have the broad support of their own people, where they're engaged in a brutal counterinsurgency that guarantees widespread destruction of the land and the civilian population. And once again, as in Vietnam, we're simply not achieving our stated objectives. And persisting in the war, again, long after the American public has concluded that the war is at least mistaken, if not immoral. So, that didn't take too long to say, but no one says it in that film and in much other places.
Go ahead.
I'm Bill Earhart, and I'm one of those veterans that Burns and Novick put in their series. And I can tell you that a whole hell of a lot ended up on the cutting room floor. John McAuliffe can tell you that I spent 6 years biting my fingernails waiting to see what the hell they did with me. And by last June, when Burns was saying that bullshit, I was apoplectic. Poor John I was driving him crazy with, oh, fuck, what have I done? They're going to make a jackass out of me. It turned out to be not as bad as I thought it was going to be. And I won't get into detail because probably there's a million people here who would like to talk for 2 hours as I would. But the one thing they did, you have to understand that Burns and Novick, Bank of America is not going to underwrite a scathing indictment of American imperialism. It just ain't going to happen. There is good information out there, lots of it. Chris has written some of it. David's film is brilliant, but David's film isn't shown on public television. There's a reality to what's going to get out there, and the one thing that I'm glad I participated in is that because I've been in it, I've been invited to speak and write New York Times, NPR, all sorts of outlets. I was just doing it last night, which is why I got here late today, where I can tell people exactly what I think. And I sat on a stage with Lynn Novick and told her I was the anti-war movement, and I wasn't spitting on myself and calling myself a baby killer.
Can I make one quick comment?
Sure.
Yeah, just really quick, about the Burns Novick series. I asked my students in every class, since it came out, how many people saw it? Not one student saw it. So in some ways, I think, Burns Novick, we care a lot about it. I'm not sure, I think it was pretty much our generation, maybe people a little younger, who really were absorbed by it. But younger generation, maybe that's a sad thing in some ways. Younger generation just, and these are smart history students at a fancy elite school, it might as well not have happened.
Did you ask them what books they read instead?
Go ahead. If
Yeah,
I may ask for
my name is Ron
short
Schneck.
comments.
I'm a Vietnam vet and a long time CAT affiliated with VVAW. Just like other people here, real quickly, and I apologize to everybody here. I tried to watch the Burns thing also, and I apologize because I tried to watch it sober. If that ever happens again, I'm going to be seriously fucked up. But there is, on a serious note, there's a number of things, and I hope it's also really touched on tomorrow with the GI press and the thing on the GI movement. And that is the internationalism that existed along with the heroic struggle of the Vietnamese people cannot be underestimated, and it's so far in some ways it's been left out. I came of age after Vietnam. You had African liberation struggles. You had the Tricontinental. You had the living memory of Che. There was struggle. There was a real vision of other ways to organize society and look at the world that is now what, ISIS, a caliphate from the 8th century or something like that. And developing that vision, that's a real difficult struggle, and it's a struggle that has to be taken on. And that's one of the things that we are faced with, both young and old, in terms of striving. One other thing that I want to say, real quickly, and that is when you have radical soldiers, men and women, who revolt against their military, and I would draw a very strong line with the struggles of national liberation struggles in the United States and around the world. I actually see huge connections. There's a reason there are communists, excuse me. There are Confederate iconographic statues in San Diego. Harriet Tubman, Denmark VC, you cannot find that in any history books. You're not going to find soldiers who revolt against the U.S. military, whether it's going back to the Revolutionary War, the Indian Wars, to now. They're going to try to write, very powerful institutions are going to write that stuff out of history and try to keep that as blank as possible. You know, so.
I think we have.
That's it.
Yeah,
Yes, go ahead.
I had a question for Michael, because I thought you brought up a really good point right at the tail end. Well, you brought up a lot of good points, but at the tail end, because it's something I've thought about a lot. You drew a distinction between when you're talking about Vietnam and now, because when you were part of the Vietnam movement, it's not inconceivable, the alternative to losing the war and having the government become what it is now in Vietnam, which is a unified, it's still the Communist Party obviously governing there. And that's obviously worked out in most ways fine in terms of U.S. foreign policy. But you pointed out that's not a viable alternative with a Taliban-run state in Afghanistan or an ISIS-run state in Iraq. And whatever, I guess something that I can't get past on my own intellectual level is you can't really get past that until we have a foreign policy solution for those problems. Now, I would argue that we're not even trying to do that anymore, to figure that out. Now we're just using the military as a Band-Aid to keep bombing. But I'm just curious, what if anybody on the panel or anybody in this room has any ideas of how to deal with that, because I think that's a really good salient point you made.
Maybe we can take one more question here at the center. I saw him.
He has a question. Is there any answer for it?
Well, what I would say is, let's look at the record of American foreign policy, since World War II, and the assumption that we have to be the policemen of the world because in the absence of that, anarchy and greater chaos would reign. I just think the record itself shows that where we've been more destabilizing and created more anarchy. It's not to make a brief for the Taliban or ISIS. I'm just saying, there may be other solutions that are closer to home. And I said, look, we haven't tried that.
Yeah, I disagree with Chris some of that. I think it's not enough for people, anti-militarists, people in the peace movement, to just say, don't do anything. Yeah, but I think multilateral, multinational efforts. I'm not sure what I think about the first Gulf War. Actually, I've gone back and forth on that, but at least that was an attempt to be multinational. And Saddam Hussein had no right to take over Kuwait. I think that's pretty clear by any reckoning. I don't think, but.
They were slammed through.
Anyway, let me get at it. I'm just saying. I think it's. I think it's a serious problem when you have the most powerful military nation on earth, especially run by, the worst president I know of, and the worst party backing him up I know of. I don't want Trump to do anything, that's for damn sure. But at the same time, I think we have to be willing to say that, unless you want to say the military should be disbanded, the military's going to be there, and okay. But that's not going to happen very soon. In the meantime, people like us have to have a foreign policy. And, the safest foreign policy, Michael Walzer quoted before, says support our friends. So, for example, in Iraq, there's this group of Kurdish militants, YPG, I think. Their women fight with them. Their politics is kind of anarchist. I think they're great, but that's not going to be the future of Iraq or even of Kurdistan, for that matter. So, all I'm saying is it's a problem. We can't just assume it's not a problem. If
I may, on this last point, this is my own personal opinion. When the Twin Towers were attacked, following U.S. diplomacy and geostrategy, I thought they are going to react immediately. They are going to strike immediately. Then I was pleasantly surprised that they did not. So I thought, this time they are thinking It's not trigger happy, So I thought, oh, well, I mean, they're thinking. And I thought they were thinking what? Well, why did they, and afterwards they knew that many Saudis were taking part. I mean, if they had kept their heads cool, they would not have attacked Afghanistan. Now, not to mention Iraq, and so on and so forth. So I think that today we mention ISIS, Taliban, and this and that. They are, in a sense, the consequences of an absence of proper, geostrategic thinking. And so now we see the US being all over trying to sort of stop the fires that they kindle themselves, and they can't stop them. And so, very, very frankly, that is also why it's so difficult for the broad public in the US. Added to what I said, that you can't see the dead. During the Vietnam War, you saw the dead, our dead, your dead, all over the place, But now it's very far away, we don't see it. And on top of that, it's very abstract because of, the pretext of anti-terrorism. In other words, my take on this is the US superpower should rethink the limits of its power. It's overstretched. It's doing things that it can't handle afterwards. And who's paying the price? The people. My personal opinion is that today, you listen to the United Nations. Since the intervention in Iraq, there have been several 100,000 civilian deaths. Not necessarily because of the US troops, but because you unleashed the Pandora's box, of terrorism. In other words, the terrorist attacks that we see today, the pretext is the US intervention. You see? And so when you look at what's going on in the world, especially in the Middle East, what is at fault? First is US diplomacy and geostrategy. Only next, the US military. So I don't think we should say, this is a problem of the military. It's a problem at the very top, at the very heart of the command, and the command should always be civilian. There's a problem, you have a problem there. I'm sorry.
My name is Skip Delano, and I was a Vietnam vet and active in the anti-war movement, GI anti-war movement. And I'll sort of address what Michael said, and one is to say that our military authorities never ever celebrated soldiers who dissented during the Vietnam War. They did everything to suppress that and stop that. And after the war is over, they're certainly not going to go back and say, hey guys, write histories about it. We want everybody to know about this. And they certainly today don't want people to know about it. Whereas the women's movement, civil rights movement, those are things that won great victories and are celebrated today. But they're never, our military, our government is not going to want you to write a history that they're going to spread all to our youth in America. That's not going to happen. However, I don't think we should miss one important lesson out of the GI movement. There are Iraqi vets, there are Afghani vets here today. Those guys, if I'm not wrong, spoke out when they were in the military against the war at that time. They marched against the war at that time. They're here today and calling on their brothers and sisters to do the same today and oppose U.S. aggression abroad. If you go back and you look before Vietnam, soldiers did not question their government, period. There was no dissent within the military before the Vietnam War. It just did not exist. You criticize the president, you could get court-martialed and put in jail. Well, that changed during the Vietnam War. We could not only, after Lieutenant or Howe marched against the war, I guess in '65, he was court-martialed, but it ended after that. People were, court-martialed for various kinds of things in different kinds of ways. However, what we did establish is the right of soldiers, men and women, to oppose the war, to criticize their president, criticize military authority. That has changed. That is a victory for the people everywhere. And so that's a good thing. It's one thing we should not forget here when we're talking about this period and looking back. And any comments you have on it, I'd love to hear it.
Really quick, I think it's a great point. But just a little corrective: the government doesn't stop people from writing history. Yeah. And what the point I was making is that most historians, as Chris knows very well, most most historians today, support the politics we're talking about here. They could write the histories that they wanted to, but there are reasons why most of them don't, because again it's more complicated, because they have to get into the question of what about the troops who are fighting those wars, fighting unjust wars. And one of the great things about this conference is it makes clear that they were central, those who opposed that war. But as Chris said, most people don't know that. Most people, I show in my class when I teach about the 60s, I always show that clip from April 24, 71 of vets throwing their medals over the fence at the Capitol, and my students say, "What?" It's like this was that's probably in the evaluations of the course they say that film was the best thing about the course because nobody ever told me that.
Asher apologizes. He had to go to the dinner of the president of the university tonight. So that's a good excuse. But a couple of, let's go with the lady here, then Jonathan, and then James over here.
Well, if we're talking about the role of the military in the anti-war movement, I think it's very important for us to realize that the vets brought something back very special, which was a sense of collectivity. And I'm at UMass Amherst, but I started off being for the war as a kid. So you learn by people telling you, the people who've been around before, like you said, these little old ladies with sneakers, probably younger than me now, that helped us with Women's Strike for Peace, whatever, get our high school buses to go against the war. But at UMass Amherst, tuition was free, rent was cheap enough, so VVAW had homes, and they accepted in the guys who were still for the war or misguided. They were armed, which made the movement a little bit difficult, but they gave a sense of collectivity because of their experience in the war, I think, and a sense of brotherhood that did impact the anti-war movement as a whole. I think that's a gift about collectivity. It's a problem we have now because we live in, nobody's mentioned it, a neoliberal capitalist world where it's all about individuals articulating with the market. It's very hard to get people to come together in groups. But that was something that veterans have an experience of groupness that was very important. The other point is the issue of racism. We know it wasn't just about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and particularly and Muhammad Ali, but every kid, 16 and 17, who heard about Woodstock, heard Jimi Hendrix lament in that national anthem. And that's just one example of the African American contribution to criticizing the war. And that criticism in the ranks of the soldiers came home. It was African American soldiers who talked about imperialism and colonialism. I didn't know those words. What was my thing? And I bet many of us who were working class kids, first we supported the war wholeheartedly because our sons and brothers were going. Who these kids get, going to strike? What's that? Then when we came against the war, simply to bring our boys home. It was a gift of the African American and VVAW soldiers that taught us about it a lot more. I think we need to, even though the movements, you may say the ranks of black and white soldiers were separate in the movement, the cross-fertilization, first of all, it was drugs, it was African-American parlance, it was African-American music, and it came home to every American family across all 50 states. And that is a gift of the African-American people to the anti-war movement, and that is very minimal in the histories of the anti-war movement. That and the collectivity, which I think we need to look at if we want to bring young people into any kind of activism, because they basically articulate with the internet and social media, etc. They don't know about meetings, which suck, but you have to have them, So and the other thing is, I want to thank you all for this thing. Very important because, what did Utah Phillips say? A long memory makes the best radicals. So that and activism, forever activists.
That's a great statement. I just echo one part of it. Racial cohesion and unity may have fallen apart a bit in rear areas, on bases, but an act of combat refusal in the field requires the very unity that keeps you alive when you're actually fighting. It requires that same solidarity to resist fighting, and that is cross-racial, and people felt that.
David, real quickly, I just want to say, This microphone is off. I just want to say that I think we got to be careful that we don't validate the dominant narrative, if you will, by talking about our movements in separate lanes. There's a term we use, and it's just not coming to me. But in terms of these separate lanes, in other words, the cross-fertilization, intersectionality. In other words, and I'm actually adding what you stated. I mean, you when we talk. So in other words, and Michael, you sparked this thought in me that we shouldn't. I would challenge not to say women's movement, LGBT movement, civil rights movement, anti-war movement. If we talk about a military budget, what does a military budget do to a domestic economy? What does a mass military budget mean for the building of schools and local communities? What does a mass military budget mean for those who are still locked in reservations today? What does a mass military budget mean to hospital closing? If we talk in that narrative, not just about ending the war, which is the most vital piece, but why do we want to end the war? Is it just because we believe in the ideal of peace? Or do we believe in what peacemaking does to make a community holistic, to actually feed, clothe, and house people? I mean, this is the type of language, I'm done, David, that Reverend Jesse Lewis Jackson talked about in the 80s. Not, I know how we think about Jesse maybe today, but he talked about cutting the military budget in half to actually accomplish a lot of these priorities. I'm done.
Hello, is this working?
David, and then Josh in the back.
Two things. One for Michael. There's another book called The War Against War. And it's by Hans Friedrich. And he set up a museum that the Nazis kept on running from place to place. And maybe we could learn from the War Against War and create internet memes using the kind of montage that Friedrich used, which was, have the Kaiser stepping on duckboards that are covered in blood. Underneath, you have a whole bunch of dead bodies. The other thing I wanted to bring up was, and I'm not sure if anyone's looked at this material except me, but there's a whole group there was a serious effort in the GI press to come to an understanding of what does the end of the draft mean and who would fight the wars. And there's a whole series of articles, most of which, in retrospect, turned out to be true, of where is America going to fight its next wars and who is going to fight it. And the areas they said were Central America and the Middle East. And the people they said were going to fight it were servicemen and reservists. And it's a really interesting sub-theme that begins around 1972 and sort of peters out around 1975, and is worth looking into. But if there's someone can come up with some Friedrich internet memes for Facebook, yeah, that would be cool. Make pro-war people vomit in their breakfast.
Okay, David is next, and then Josh.
I can speak without a microphone. I never speak for 2 hours. I'm a university professor, so 50 minutes is usually how long I'll be. A lot of good points that need to be followed up more. One that's not been mentioned, except in Michael's talk, is the U.S. military has been used to justify a bunch of progressive social policies in American history. The U.S. military has been used to justify spending on education, spending on infrastructure. I went to school. I'm a National Defense student alum. I studied poetry. Progressive social policy, ultimately and half-heartedly on race and on gay rights. And the United States has been very weak in developing progressive social movements to do that, absent the military. And that's a challenge for activists.
There's one thing about the microphones, the live feed can't hear.
Yeah, Josh,
If you don't talk
use
to
the
the
microphone,
microphone. Who's the lab?
Josh.
Hey, I want to go back to the question of the opposition to the war linked to the ISIS, that it's Islamic fundamentalism and all this. First of all, a government of Christian fundamentalism that we live under now has no moral authority to judge anybody else in the world. this is there was a lot of outrage when you had newsreel of ISIS cutting the throat of their prisoners of war, and how horrific and horrible that was. And while you can agree with that, the annihilation of 250,000 people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in an instant is a little bit different. So people who are getting ready to have a moral, that this country in any way, this government in any way, can be the moral arbiter of what goes on in the world is insane.
I hope you didn't hear me as saying that I thought it was fine for the U.S. to be in Iraq because of ISIS. What I was saying is, or if you're asking the Taliban, the problem is that, again, if you are asking people to devote a large part of their lives to opposing those wars, they have to have convincing arguments about the question, what happens if we're not there? And to me, our side hasn't come up with, very convincing arguments yet. I think we should be out of those countries tomorrow, but do I feel great about what will happen when we leave? No, the people control their own countries and they'll keep fighting with each other. The way people are in Syria, not that bad, but I think it's also important for us to think, I don't want to start a whole argument here, but America's not responsible for everything bad in the world. People have agency, and these movements that ISIS is part of, Taliban's part of, Al Qaeda was part of, that's a movement. Yes, it was partly those movements grew in part because of American imperialism. That's certainly true, but people have an ideology they feel very strongly about, and it's and people believed, and they still believe, that it's a better way to run the world the way their interpretation of Islam, goes. So I think it's wrong. It's in some ways condescending for people on the left like us to say, everything, ISIS and Taliban and all that, happened because of American policy. Yes, American policy helped them to grow. That's certainly true. Without the invasion of Iraq, they probably wouldn't have grown as much. But those movements have a longer history as well, just as all movements in this country have a longer history. And we can't just assume that somehow, if America wasn't doing these bad things, these things wouldn't exist.
Paul? Paul?
Yes. I'm Paul Lauder. I'm old enough, older than most people here. I started working for the American Friends Service Committee, the peace area, whatever it's called, in 1963. There was not a peace movement in 1963. There were some peace organizations like the AFSC, like Women's Strike for Peace, and so forth. There was not a focus for it. There was the Say Nuclear Policy Committee, focused on nuclear policy. Dr. Spock was worried. By April of 1965, you had the first large demonstration led by SDS in Washington. It speaks to Michael's point, I think it was your point, about how peace action grows quickly and has to. And between 1963 and 1965, it did precisely that. But it tells us something. Wherever we are right now, and I think we could have a good deal of disagreement about that, we don't know what will be the case, what will be the situation 2 years from now. And I think people have to be both encouraged and have their eyes open about the possibility of the growth of movements and the embrace of the errors that we made and continue to make now. And in a way, what's going on politically in Washington may provide precisely that sort of opportunity. Remains to be seen. But having lived through that process in 2 years and a few more years after that, I want to be positive about it. I don't want us to sink into that despair that one has. Well, we just don't have it together yet. Yeah, we don't have it together, but we did get it together. We did get it together, and I really have the sense that we will again.
Yeah, that's a great statement. One follow-up to that, because I share that view and often tell my students that history isn't inevitable, and that, for example, no one in the early 80s was predicting that within the decade the Soviet Union was going to implode, or that, that Nelson Mandela was going to be released from prison and become the president of South Africa. The unpredictable, surprising things do happen. So.
John, maybe one or two more questions, and then we'll let the panel wrap up. John.
Stereo. Speak out of both sides of your mouth, John.
I just want to, I don't want to let the U.S. off the hook on this, even as much as Michael did. With regard to Afghanistan, the United States intervened between 1978 and 1990 to create a Islamic fundamentalist resistance inside Afghanistan to overthrow a progressive secular government, and succeeded in doing it as part of the U.S. ruling class war against the Soviet Union. So they created this Al-Qaeda and Taliban and all of that. They created a situation that allowed it to grow. U.S. policy inside Iraq, following the rise of the resistance movement, when the strategists of the U.S. saw that they weren't able to defeat the guerrillas on the ground by directly fighting them, was to promote the fighting between the Iraqis, and they instigated that kind of fighting and promoted it so that Shia and Sunni groups would fight against each other. So I think we can't let the U.S. off the hook on any of this. And there's no reason, certainly, we can't say what kind of, a great government is going to follow in Afghanistan. But what we can do all the time is say the U.S. got to get out of there. Okay, okay, just one other point quickly. The people talking about how we're unable to get our story out. When it's not like it's just because we're doing things wrong, or it's very consciously in the service of those who rule the country. It's not a conspiracy, it's a class that rules this country. And they do not want there to be, that people should learn that there was a military resistance, that there was a popular resistance during the Vietnam War that helped the Vietnamese people, who were the main fighters in that war, and who had a lot of allies at the time that enabled them to keep fighting in a very powerful way, that were effective in doing it. They purposely distort it. It's not just an accident, and it's not just because we blunder. So that's what we should keep in mind, I think. That's it.
Okay. Well, let's let the panelists, if we can, one last round in terms of final comments or reactions to any of the comments. So maybe Chris, if you wanted to start first.
The only thought I had, inspired by the great comment about right after 9/11, they're thinking, I remember telling a friend, nothing good can come of this. But upon reflection, I did realize that this was, in fact, a missed opportunity, and we've had a number of them. End of the Cold War, 1945. This missed opportunity was simply this. We could have gone to the world and said, we now have suffered on our own soil, for the first time in a long time, the kind of devastation that most of the rest of you have experienced. We look to you for advice and support, and it was pouring in. There was an extraordinary candlelight vigil in the streets of Tehran. There was a moment where we could say, okay, there is a threat of terrorism, and we're going to approach it with lots of ideas. We're going to open to other ideas. Instead, of course, Bush drew the land, you're either for us or against us, and if you're not with us, you're on the side of the terrorist. And we're going to declare
reading children's books.
We're going to declare permanent, unlimited war on terror instead of, and if you don't agree with that tactic, you're a bad guy. But many other people were saying there's another tactic. It's more like a police operation. You share information, on and on. So that's my.
Well, I said that you have it harder, but people like you I'm sure we'll keep at it, and we'll find a way to bring your government to reality and to responsibility. Telling your government, don't do things that you don't know, the consequences of for others. Make sure you know what you're doing. I'm not sure I can be very optimistic these days, but but at least, I mean, this is first of all your responsibility. Your friends across the world, can try and help by being candid, sharing our thoughts, our analysis, our experiences. But at the end of the day, it's really your homework. So good luck.
I could say a lot about some comments, but I won't. I mean, just in terms of, just one quick thing, and then I want to say something more optimistic, which is that government is not censoring historians. I mean, we can write any books we want to. It doesn't mean people have to buy them, but it's a choice that people make to write about a certain book or not to write about a certain book. I mean, there's a lot of problems in this country, but being able to write what you want to write is not one of them. So I think that's just wrong. But in a more optimistic sense, there is resistance in this country right now. It's not a resistance that is focused on our foreign policy or on the wars that we're fighting in Muslim countries and shouldn't be fighting. I certainly agree with it. We shouldn't be fighting them. But I think the best way for people who want to build a larger consciousness about the problems of militarism and the military budget is to be part of that larger struggle. And that struggle, as always in history, at least in American history, has got to be both, as Jonathan was saying before, an inside-outside struggle. You've got to be in the streets when that makes sense to be in the streets. You've got to be building collectivities online and in meetings as well. But you also have to, elect people who, can have a little bit of state power, because without that, in the end, I mean, as you know, the War Powers Act, that we heard about before, that got passed, by Congress. It wasn't acted on enough because the anti-war movement was declining by that point for reasons we know, but it did get passed. And so it's got to be always that outside strategy. That's the only way change ever happens.
Thank you.